Viewers, welcome to our today's session of the analysis of Fathers of Nations. As we had begun a few days ago, today I would like to continue from where I left. And remember, in our previous discussion, I had hinted that I will be analyzing this particular novel in bits based on the various episodes that Paul Vita decided to have in every chapter. In this first chapter, we have 4 episodes, minor episodes. And the first one, which I labeled Checking In, is what I took you through in our previous video. And basically, it was about 4 people checking into the Seamount Hotel, and each one of them was described in in a specific way based on their appearance. What I would like maybe to remind us is that these people are assigned rooms based on where they come from. It is not by coincidence, for example, that Professor Karanja, who comes from Kenya in East Africa, is assigned a room on the east wing of the Seamount Hotel. It is also not a coincidence that Comrade Melusi, who comes from the southern part of Africa, is assigned a room on the southern wing of the Seamount Hotel. It is also not by coincidence that a younger man who looks like a sumo wrestler, whose identity, as is revealed later, is Pastor Chamaka, who is a pastor at the church inside Africa, or CIA, found in Lagos, West Africa, is assigned a room on the west wing of the Seamount Hotel. And lastly, the youngest of the 4 men, who is Engineer Tahir, from the northern part of Africa, Libya to be specific, is assigned a room on the north wing of the Seamount Hotel. I feel I needed to draw your attention to that kind of organization as planned by the writer Paul B. Vita. The second episode, which I labeled The Guide, or you can also choose to call it The Phone Calls, is on page 2 of the novel. And here we meet someone who refers to himself as their guide, or the guide of the 4 men we met earlier. So in this episode, he makes a call, and the first call he makes is to Professor Kimani. Professor Kimani looks at his clock or his watch and realizes that it is not 7 o'clock yet, but he's already receiving a call. He looks out of a window and he realizes that it is pitch dark already, yet it is not 7. And he wonders to himself how fast the African night falls, because it is not yet 7, but it is already dark. And the darkness is compared, or how the darkness falls is compared through a simile to how heavy rain of ink would have fallen if at all we had anything like a heavy rain of ink, if at all it existed. So this is meant to help you draw a mental image of how suddenly an African night can fall. We realize that Professor Kimani is irritable or easily annoyed, because he is already annoyed by the caller, because the caller says, "Is that Professor Kimani?" And he does not respond. And the caller goes on to say, "Hey, I heard you pick up, so I know you are there." Dr. Afolabi hears someone call his name from behind. He stops walking and turns to look who the caller was. He sees a girl, and this is a girl he has never seen before in his life. The vivid description of the girl is that she was wearing a scarlet blouse, a black skirt, and red high heels. Vivid description is meant to help you draw the image of Fiona McKenzie. Make you imagine how she looks like. A rhetorical question follows. Who was she? This is simply meant to help us see the confusion Dr. Afolabi finds himself in, because here is a girl who calls him, but he has never met this girl or never seen such a girl before. So he wonders who this girl could be. Perhaps she had called someone else, he tells himself. But the girl calls him again. "Dr. Afolabi, may I please have a word with you?" He heeds the call, and she leads him to a corner that has 2 chairs. And then in a conversation that ensues, she reveals that she is Fiona McKenzie, working for the Gambian News, and she is Fiona McKenzie because she was adopted by a Scottish family of Ian and Elspeth Mackenzie. They have since gone back to Scotland or Edinburgh, but because they had adopted her, she still keeps the name Mackenzie. She also reveals that her own parents died while she was young. Dr. Afolabi tells himself that this girl was cute as a button and sharp as a needle. Her eyes were wide and white like a pair of moons. Those are 2 similes that are meant to give us the description of Fiona McKenzie, so that, as I had said earlier, we can imagine how she looks like. She must be a very beautiful woman. Technology as a theme first appears when she draws out of her handbag a small recording device and requests to record the interview between her and Dr. Afolabi. We move on. As Dr. Afolabi introduces himself on page 6, he says, "Just call me Abiola." She confirms that she already knew about him. She even knew that he studied at Harvard University in the USA, and now he teaches at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. She tells him that she got to know about him from his book, Failure of States. So Dr. Afolabi is a writer. We had earlier on mentioned that he's a proud man. We see his pride again on page 6, when we're told that he averted his eyes to enjoy his fame in the correct manner. With humility, he hoped she would easily see through. So he is proud of his achievement and the fact that his achievements are even known outside his country. Fiona McKenzie goes on to say, that when she heard that this famous writer by the name of Dr. Afolabi was in the Gambia, at the Seamount Hotel to be precise, she had to go and meet him. She goes on to also say that she was surprised to realize that he was not like all those other professors that usually don't know how to dress. She expected to meet an academic scarecrow by virtue of how Dr. Afolabi was dressed, only to realize that he was a well-dressed man in his 40s. Dr. Afolabi tells her that he is 45. At this point, we also get to know about Fiona Mackenzie's age, because she says that she is 35. She is 35. She goes on to say, I was beginning to ramble on, wasn't I? So she acknowledges that she was already talking too much when they had just met. And she goes to the topic that had brought her to meet Dr. Afolabi. She says, now, then, Africa's heads of state will soon start a debate at the Pinnacle Hotel, which is 2 streets from here, and I'll be covering the debate for the Gambian News. I understand you will be an advisor to the heads of state during the debate. Could you give me some background? And this prompts Dr. Afolabi to reveal that the 50 heads of states meeting in the Gambia, Banjul, were going to discuss a document titled Way Omega. And this Way Omega had been created by 20 Nobel laureates who thought they had discovered a common way of developing Africa. They published their discovery, which were later on looked at by African ministers for planning from the various countries that made up Africa. These ministers for planning liked the document, and therefore the heads of state were here to discuss this proposed common way of developing Africa. So this tells us that at least the heads of state have a desire to develop not only their countries, but Africa as a whole, Africa as a continent. We go on to see whether really they mean it. So Dr. Afolabi is very optimistic that Way Omega will change African politics, and it is the best way, according to him, at least according to him, it is the best way to deal with those perennial African problems, including military coups, rigged elections, and foul play. So he believes Way Omega is going to ensure that these things are things of the past. But Fiona challenges him that not all those leaders seated in Banjul may be in support of Way Omega, or may be in support of any method of dealing with African problems, because they are the direct beneficiaries of most of these problems. In particular, most of them took over power with the help of foul play, military coups, and rigged elections. So there's no way they would be seated here in Banjul to look for ways of dealing with the methods they used to ascend to power. So here we get to see perennial common African problems, including rigged elections, military coups, and foul plays, especially by our leaders. Here, Paul Vita uses irony to ridicule our leaders and how they lie to us that did they want to deal with these problems, yet they don't deal with them, or they are not interested in dealing with them. The irony is, we do not expect the direct beneficiaries of rigged elections, of foul play, of military coups to be seated in Banjul discussing how to get rid of those African problems, or what I have labeled perennial African problems. We also get to know selfishness among our leaders, because they only pursue certain causes for their own selfish interests. And here the writer says, on one side of it has defenders of existing arrangements. These are sure about their loss if those arrangements end. So their selfishness will drive them to fighting tooth and nail to keep the status quo, or to maintain the status quo, just because they have to defend themselves. That is selfishness. The other side of this selfishness again is that of challengers of existing arrangements. These are not yet sure about their gain if new arrangements replace old ones, so they do not fight so hard to win them. So they do not fight because they are not sure whether these proposed changes will benefit them or not. Maybe they'll fight tooth and nail only to end up being the losers. So they are not interested in fighting so hard. And that is selfishness. We said that today Dr. Afolabi appears very optimistic about the future of Africa. And Fiona Mackenzie is interested in knowing why today he is so optimistic. Yet in his book, and even from the title, Failure of States, is a lot of pessimism. And this rubs Dr. Afolabi the wrong way. He's so furious. And this may lead us, or actually leads us to concluding that he is irritable, short-tempered, easily annoyed. Because what we see as a trivial thing of being challenged to explain why he sounds so pessimistic in his book, Failure of States, yet today he has changed his attitude towards the possibility of having development in Africa, and he believes it is doable. He becomes furious as a fire eater who does not know the difference between journalism and bad manners. So he believes she's a bad-mannered girl. But still, we see change, or we could put it under the theme of change. And our first illustration of the theme of change is in Dr. Afolabi's change of attitude from being pessimistic to being positive about the possibility of there being a turn of tables in terms of whether Africa can develop or not. Dr. Afolabi is proud, as we had mentioned earlier, and the illustration here on page 9 is he reminds Fiona Mackenzie that he did not just come, but African heads of states wanted him to come, or wanted him to be there. Not just to be there, but as their advisor. He says, I repeat, presidents, there is so merit in the book you dismiss as pessimistic, and wanted me to assure them that Way Omega agrees with it. He is rude and arrogant because he tells Fiona Mackenzie, on further thought, let me not let me not. I don't think I have to defend my book before anyone, least of all before a third-rate reporter for the Zambian News. He refers to her as a third-rate reporter. That is so rude and so arrogant of him. On the contrary, Fiona Mackenzie is calm, composed, and tolerant, because even after being referred to as a third-rate reporter for the Zambian News, she calmly only reminds him that it is not even the Gambian News. It is not the Zambian News, but the Gambian News. On page 10, we see the writer's use of coincidence. When things were heating up, or were just beginning to heat up, he brings in coincidence, where Fiona Mackenzie's boss coincidentally calls her to the office. He goes on to show us how temperamental he can be. He says, a man you claim is your boss calls you. Therefore, I must compress my example into a word. And the word is, I suggest that you go read my book, not just its cover. So he is temperamental. The writer takes us to the next episode of chapter 1. And this episode talks about the preparations, or the necessary preparations, for the beginning of the summit. The writer reminds us that 49 heads of state were in Banjul for the summit, and all of them looked or appeared very happy. He tries to guess why they look so happy, and his guess is through a rhetorical question, actually two rhetorical questions. All looked happy, and why not? Had they not escaped from troublemakers in their home countries? That rhetorical question implies that these heads of states considered citizens who tried to negatively, or to actually criticize them, as troublemakers. So they didn't want criticism of any nature. The mention of Kunta Kinte introduces us to a style known as allusion to literature, because at this point the writer refers to Alex Haley's work, particularly a novel known as Roots, with the subtitle or the subheading, The Saga of an American Family. In that particular book, Alex Haley mixes both fiction and facts when he talks about one of his ancestors who was Gambian, born in the Gambia, but sold into America as a slave. And that was the guy that Alex Haley gave the name Kunta Kinte. So Haley himself admitted that the story of Kunta Kinte is not just completely fictional, but rather a mixture of both what indeed happened and fiction meant to make his novel. Preparations for the summit are underway in this particular episode, and the narrator tells us, which is very ironic, that the Gambians had to pay for the visit made by the 49 heads of states. I said it is ironic because we expect them to enjoy, now that 49 presidents were visiting from different countries. Is the price higher than it is in Africa? Here, before the dignitaries arrive, bulldozers dispatched at night in slum clearance exercises to demolish roadside kiosks on which whole families depend for livelihoods. This is very ironic, and this irony brings forth another style called satire, where the writer is ridiculing how our African leaders, not only presidents, behave. They go for pleasing other people at the expense of serving their people. It is like they trade their people's comfort with pleasing visitors. You can imagine demolishing kiosks on which whole families depended. Roads get rare layers of tarmac at times of maximum traffic. This way, motorists come to a standstill when it really hurts, and checkpoints sprout everywhere. This way, guards get even more bases for extorting bribes from passers-by. So extortion as a theme, and bribery as the other theme, and exploitation in general, because they are exploiting their people. Instead of taking this advantage of visitors to improve the livelihoods of their citizens, they do the opposite. Dignitaries arrive finally, water taps at which whole neighborhoods queue to get just buckets of water dry up. Because now, all water has to go to new water fountains built to mesmerize. Priorities are turned upside down, because water that is meant to help families living in slums is diverted, and you mesmerize visitors in the form of fountains for this purpose of aesthetics. Ministry of Internal Security and the Ministry of Defense has a task of ensuring that there's a lot, or there's enough security for the 50 heads of state. And the kind of security we get to witness at the Pinnacle Hotel where these people will be meeting makes us wonder why all that kind of security should be brought for the welfare of only 49 people, actually 50 people, yet it has never been brought to help the ordinary citizen. The task of intelligence squarely fell on the shoulders of the police, while combat was to be handled by the army. Actually, we can juxtapose the security of the ordinary citizen with that of only a few heads of state. And then our conclusion would be the place of the ordinary citizen is that he or she does not matter as much as one president. There are several rhetorical questions on page 13. The first one says, should this guest sit here and eat next to that? This rhetorical question is meant to draw our attention to the challenge that the host country faced when it came to organizing accommodation and the seating arrangement and eating arrangements for the visitors. It also brings out animosity between presidents of different countries, or even animosity between one country and the other in Africa. We expect that we are all supposed to be brothers because we are all Africans, but different countries have animosity between themselves because of very trivial reasons. And the animosity here, we have the example of Eritrea and Ethiopia. We're told that Eritrea and Ethiopia might seem one country, the host reasons, but the presidents rarely see eye to eye, so they should not be seated next to each other. So the relationship between the various African countries is also mentioned. And as seen, some countries have very good relations, like Kenya and Tanzania do, while others have strained relationships, like Eritrea and Ethiopia. The writer also goes on to highlight how presidents misuse the resources at their disposal by carrying more than the people they needed to travel. But the Gambia decided to deal with this problem in their own way, and I believe they dealt with the problem in a very good manner by assigning 4 rooms to each of those presidents, regardless of the number of people they carried. That marks the end of chapter 1. I will continue to chapter 2 in our next session. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel